I'm looking forward to talking you through the step 2 in the AI Readiness 7-step framework. So today is all about how you make a decision about which of the challenges your organization is facing are the ones that AI can help you with, and then to decide between them where you're going to focus your attention. So I'm going to start off by exploring the types of challenges that are faced by educational institutions, educators as well, and identify some criteria that we can use to help make decisions about which of the challenges are most amenable to being leveraged by artificial intelligence. And as always, I will prompt everybody to try and look at yourself and your practice, your school or university, college, through a data and AI lens so that you can develop an AI mindset. And I'm pleased that again this week, I'm joined by Karine George, who's a very experienced primary school leader and advisor, and she'll be discussing her perspective about this step in the AI readiness ethical framework that we're following in these webinars. So as always, I like to introduce the team behind these webinars, and I will stress that other members of the team will be running some of the webinars as we go through the weeks. So we have Carmel Kent, Mohammed Ali Chowdhury, Luca Grover, myself, Rose Luckin, Anita Moini, and Benedict Boulay. And we all have a background in artificial intelligence, education, data science. And just as a quick reminder, here's the framework that we're working towards. So this is the 7 steps to AI readiness. And in the last dedicated seminar for educators, we looked at step 1, which is about educating the team, educating staff, exciting them, enthusing them about developing an AI mindset. And today we're looking at step 2, which is about tailoring and honing the particular challenges that you want to focus. It might be one, it might be several, but we'll have a look and see how we can do that. So that's exactly where we're going to focus today, and we'll work through the other steps in future webinars. And again, as I've said previously, but I always like to stress, artificial intelligence and human intelligence are really quite different. The artificial intelligence that we have today can help with a subset of the sorts of intelligent activities that we as humans can do. And we often underestimate our human intelligence because we prioritize certain aspects of that human intelligence. And indeed, these are the aspects that we've managed to build machines to automate. And we underestimate the incredible value of some elements of our human intelligence, such as being able to understand ourselves, to reflect on ourselves, to understand the context, the setting that we're in, to have a subjective experience, and to be able to build self-efficacy, which is a real bonus and such a useful ability as we try and learn more about the world. So it's very much about finding how our artificial intelligence can augment our human intelligence so that we can reap the best from that artificial intelligence, particularly when it comes to teaching and learning. So as I said at the start, I want to explore the types of challenges faced in educational institutions and then think about how we can whittle down the enormous number of challenges to the ones that we might want to start with when it comes to getting ready for AI. And I'm going to run through an example, and then in the second half of the webinar, I'm going to have a conversation with Karin, who's going to reflect on some of the challenges that schools would face, and then we'll talk through how we could make a decision about which of those challenges might be best tackled by AI, and look at one of them in particular. So, what kind of challenges? Now, I've deliberately picked a very different part of education to focus on to Karin. So I'm going to start with an example for higher education this week. We will be looking at examples from college and further education, as well as schools, over the coming weeks. But this week, I thought it would be interesting to look at higher education. And wow, how times have changed. Really, really interesting looking at the nature of the challenges that higher education institutions are facing. Now, in 2019, not so long ago, these were the challenges that were right at the forefront of what a lot of institutions were thinking about. There was lots of concern about student recruitment because the higher education marketplace was very competitive. Lots of concern about Brexit and its effect on higher education, challenges with respect to fees in higher education, student expectations about value for money from higher education. They're paying a lot. Are they getting value for money? Then an increasing number of alternative providers of higher education coming into the marketplace. So how were traditional universities to cope with that? UK universities were starting to drop in the global rankings. That was a concern. Decline in international reputation, again, thought to be as a result of Brexit. Real concerns about freedom of speech on campus. Who should we allow to speak, and a desire in academia for freedom of speech, but also a realization we have to keep people safe, and a worry about really good researchers from the UK moving abroad for some of the reasons in the challenges that I've already thought about, a reduction in research funding, and of course the resultant increase in international student recruitment is one of the factors that's now really quite a fundamental problem for many institutions who are concerned about whether those international students will arrive. Increase in international higher education institutions, again, that's more competition for universities, and concerns about student welfare. Notice anything missing? I thought it was really interesting there was nothing about teaching or qualifications in there, bearing in mind that teaching is really the mainstay of what universities do. But I guess it's buried perhaps in some of those concerns about student expectations. But it's interesting when you look at those challenges. And even at the beginning of 2020, so pre-pandemic, what were the concerns? Student wellbeing was right up there, a continuing concern. Climate change, that was a new one. Ongoing impact of Brexit. The student as a buyer who expects a return on investment. So that's kind of similar to the student expectations and value for money. Lots of conversations and concerns about clearing, because so many more students coming into higher education from clearing. Lots of conversations about conditional offers, non-conditional offers. When should students say yes to a university, before or after they've had their A-level results? Social justice with respect to fair admissions processes, trying to ensure that anybody who wants to go to university and works hard and is of the appropriate ability can get to university. Some very interesting concerns about technology, meeting the needs of students, and yet institutions being able to balance the expectations of students about technology with what they could afford, and interesting conversations about the changing digital ecosystem in higher education, with companies like Microsoft and Google having an increasing impact in higher education because they could offer platforms and systems that were useful to graduates, undergraduates, and even pre-admission students, so taking it right from when you start your journey in university to when you end up in the workplace. And interesting spike in universities in looking at systems like Microsoft Teams for use not just as a tool for staff communication, but also as a tool in teaching. Very interesting given what's happened subsequently. And then at the end, a really interesting one, higher education disruptors. The outcome of the general election, climate emergency, well-being and mental health. So we were thinking about things that could disrupt the situation. But of course, the disruptor that came along wasn't necessarily the outcome of the general election, a climate emergency, or simply well-being and mental health, but it was a whole lot of those wrapped up in the coronavirus pandemic. And of course, that's now left higher education with yet another set of challenges. So we're in this situation where there's lots and lots of challenges. How on earth do you make a decision about where you might use what AI has to offer to help you with these challenges? So now we've got a new Coronavirus Act, guidance that every institution has to keep up to date with. So you've got to constantly monitor that. And then of course you've got the advice and regulations and guidance from the Office for Students as well. Concerns about claims and complaints from students who feel that they've paid a big tuition fee, and have they really got the teaching that they should have done? Worries around accommodation, because whilst most students have moved out of university accommodation, some students were until very recently still in a university accommodation because they'd been locked down in that accommodation and couldn't get home. Big worry around admissions and international students. Worries now about continuity of teaching and maintaining quality and standards. Now the teaching's happening remotely. How can we provide something that's a continuous, engaging experience for students, and how can we maintain quality and standards? And then thoughts about how we do the assessment, exam and degree classification that universities have normally done very much on campus in a situation where no students are on campus. And equally, how do we support students when they're all learning remotely? And that can be particularly difficult for students with special educational needs, at a disadvantage in some way. So lots of new challenges that weren't predicted and that now universities have to face. So it's a great moment for thinking about, oh, where could AI help? And I just thought it was interesting to reflect on this context, because it's very important when it comes to making the right decisions about where to focus with our AI. Interesting comment from Simon Marginson in the Financial Times saying, shift from a seller's to a buyer's market. It's going to be chaos. The Chinese won't want to come and the Indians won't be able to come. And I'll show you a slide. The next slide illustrates why those two countries are so important to the UK. So predictions of a potential drop in income of £7 billion, a third of all tuition fees, and the statement that the pandemic is forcing a rethink of a business model built on overseas students who might stay at home. So huge changes at a moment when we really need to think about how we make a decision about where to start. And so you can see in this chart, also from the Financial Times, the number of students that come to the UK. This was in 2017 from China. Over 200,000 students came from China, and that includes a small number from India. Many more Indian students go to the US and to Australia. And if anybody wonders how much of a university's income is provided by tuition fees, this chart, also from the FT, although sourced from HESA, demonstrates that by far the largest income stream to universities is precisely from tuition fees, far greater than donations or research grants. So very, very interesting, and really highlights the problems that universities are facing. So there we've had a huge number of problems, challenges, things that universities know they really need to deal with. How can we help them make a decision about where they could focus some useful AI tools to help them decide what to do next? Well, really there's two parts to this question. There's how can AI help us to understand the problem more? So for example, how could we use AI to understand the problem around student recruitment more? And then there's a secondary part to the question, which is how can we use AI to solve that problem? But the real point that I want to make through these webinars is, I don't believe you can answer the second part of that question without asking the first part of the question. And so we focus in this webinar, and very much in this readiness course, about the first of these, so that we can then make a much more informed decision about the second part of the question. So we'll focus on the first, but we always need to bear the second part of that question in our minds. And so which challenges? Well, there's those challenges that I talked about earlier. How do we make a decision about which of them to do? Well, maybe there's a set of criteria that we could apply to these challenges to differentiate some as being more suitable than others for the application of artificial intelligence. So there's 10 criteria here. They're not by all means all the criteria we can use, but they're 10 very useful criteria. And I frame them as a set of questions here, and we'll probe some of those example challenges with these questions to see how you might go about making a decision about which challenges might be the most useful to put your AI effort into. So first of all, is it an AI compatible problem? Which basically in the world of machine learning, which is not all of AI, but it's very much the part of AI that we tend to look at the moment, at least some statistical and probability-based AI as well. But we certainly need a problem that is something that we can collect data about, that we can process in order to understand it more. And we need to think about whether the possible solutions to that problem might be ones that can come from AI as well. We need to ask what we already know, because if we know nothing, then it's hard to know where to start. But if we know something about the challenge already, we've got some leverage to start off with. We also need to think about what can we know, even if we don't know now. So there are some problems, and actually the pandemic is quite an interesting one. Will it ever be possible to know when the pandemic will stop having an impact? Certainly not for a long time, and it's probably not something that's knowable at the moment. But if we want to think about that continuity of teaching problem, well, yes, there's a lot we can know about the continuity of teaching and how to support educators and students to ensure that they have a stronger narrative, a more continuous experience. So even if we don't know it now, it's possible to know. To what extent is the situation controllable and by whom? Because if we're looking at a situation that's completely uncontrollable, then again, that can be problematic. So we need to understand where the control is, where the power is when it comes to the situation, the challenge, the problem we're looking at. What level of uncertainty is there? At the moment, there's uncertainty about a lot of things, but we need to ask that question. Really important question, do we have any data? And if we do have data, can we collect more data if we need it? And if we've got the data and we apply our AI algorithms, how accurate can we be? Is this the kind of problem where we can hope to be reasonably accurate, or at least usefully and accurate enough for it to be useful? A real fundamental question, does our institution have the appetite to change? What is their reputation for innovation? What is their risk appetite? Because if we start probing into a particular challenge, so for example, we start probing into challenges around assessment and exams, and for example, when we understand more about what's happening at the moment, might propose a framework that doesn't include exams. Maybe for some institutions that's just untenable and not something that they could ever agree with. So we need to bear that in mind when we're trying to decide where to put our energy. And then how important is solving this challenge for our institution? Because if it's useful but not very important, maybe that's not where we should focus our effort. And so we can look at these questions and use them as 10 steps, as criteria that we're going to use to make a judgment. So if we take one of those problems that I showed earlier, continuity of teaching and maintaining quality and standards, very important, and a very complex problem. Is this something that we could do something useful to understand and then potentially to provide some solutions, or at least to address using AI? Yes, absolutely. There's something we can do here. Do we already know enough to get started? Probably. We know a lot about continuity of teaching, maintaining quality and standards within a university campus. We know less about it when it's happening outside, but we've certainly got a starting point. Can we know more? Even if we don't know? Absolutely, yes, we can know more. We can find out more about what's going on and what might work. How controllable is the context and by whom? Not very. It is controllable in that we can design a way of assessing and evaluating in this situation, but we still can't control all of the contextual factors that surround the process of providing continuity in teaching and maintaining quality and standards. So yeah, there's quite a lot of uncertainty and not a great deal of control necessarily. How much data do we already have? Some, as I've said. Can we collect more data if needed? Yes, absolutely. How accurate can we be? Hard to tell, but there's a reasonable belief, obviously different across different institutions, that there's a high probability we would be able to be usefully accurate. How does the institution have the appetite to change? Again, this is something that's individual across different institutions, and that's a judgment that each individual would need to make based on their knowledge of that institution. And how important is solving the challenge for the institution? It has to be crucial. looking at the income that comes from student fees, providing a continuous, high quality teaching experience, teaching and learning experience has to be fundamental to every higher education institution. So let's do the same with assessments, exams, and degree classifications. Again, AI compatible? Yes. Do we already know how to get started? Probably yes. Can we know more? Absolutely, definitely. How controllable is the context and by whom? Not very controllable. It's hard to identify who's controlling what's happening on the outside, but we can certainly control some of what's happening when it comes to putting in place the framework for assessments, exams, and degree classifications. Definitely quite a lot of uncertainty. How much data do we already have? That's likely to be patchy because we'll have a lot about the way in which assessments and exams and the classification of the results from those exams and assessments were done in the past, but it's what we'll have about how we do this remotely. It's much more likely to be patchy. Can we collect more data if needed? Probably yes, we can. How accurate can we be? With this kind of situation, we should be able to be pretty accurate in our assessment of the problem using our AI techniques. Does the institution have the appetite to change? Everybody knows that institutions need to change in order to ensure rigorous assessment and provision of the appropriate qualifications for students in the current remote teaching situation. But how radical they would want to be in their changes, if the data suggested that that's what should happen, that's hard to know on the institution. Absolutely very important to solve this challenge for the institution. And finally, looking at student wellbeing, supporting students, they were challenges that were there both in the pre-pandemic list and the post-pandemic list of challenges, example challenges that I showed. AI compatible, probably. There's a question mark there because it depends upon what element of student well-being that we look at and think about addressing in the future. Do we already know enough to get started? Again, it's highly likely that we do, so probably. Can we know more? Absolutely, yes. How controllable is the situation in the context? Not very at the moment. There's lots of things that could be happening to students that are not within our control, but learning about them can be very useful in decisions about what we do provide. Yes, there's certainly some uncertainty. We should have some data. Most institutions should have data about this, some more than others. Can we collect more data if needed? Yes. How accurate can we be? Hopefully reasonably accurate, but it will depend a lot on precisely what data we're able to collect. The Institute's appetite for change, again, it's a very important problem for universities to solve, or challenge for them to address, if you prefer, but how radical would they want to be in the way that they address that? And when you go through your candidate challenges in this way, you can compare the way that they score, if you like, across these different 10 steps of the criteria. And that should help in making a decision about where you want to focus your attention. But there are a few points that it's important to note. Obviously, for the sake of presentation in this webinar, I've somewhat oversimplified the way that we look at applying each of those criteria, because many problems and challenges are interconnected. And whilst it's probably, and certainly in our experience, it's quite easy to filter away the challenges that you're definitely not going to prioritize for the moment, you then get down to a set where it's much harder to decide where your priorities are without going into more detail. It's also really important to recognize that the process of applying those criteria needs to be done in a setting where you are making explicit any assumptions that underlie the situation. So, for example, if there's an assumption in an institution that all students must experience or produce essays at some point in their studying, then you know that that is an assumption that's going to impact on the way that you suggest that any assessment mechanisms might change. So it's really important to get everything that's an assumption made explicit, to check that they're correct before you start the process of deciding on precisely which challenge or problem you're going to focus on. And then the second part of that question that I talked about 10 minutes ago. Could AI also help us to address the challenge as well as to understand it better? Because it's probably more productive to pick, at least initially, challenges or problems where there's potential for AI to also provide some of the answer and some of the solution. So it's a useful process, but we need to bear in mind the complexity. So I am going to stop here about 25 minutes in and see if there are any questions that people would like me to answer now. And then I'm going to move to have a conversation with Karine, and we're going to talk this through in a school context. Roland, back to you. Are there any questions that you would like me to answer at this point?
None that have come up thus far, Rose, but I'm sure if people have any in the following couple of minutes, we can address them in the next break for questions.
That's great. I always like to give a break in case there are any questions, but it's perfectly fine if there aren't. So I'm now going to ask Karine to join me. And Karine took part in the session 2 weeks ago. And so for those of you who are part of that session, you already know Karine, but I'll ask her to do a brief introduction. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that we can see Karine and myself as we have our conversation about these challenges. So, Karine, would you like to say something very quickly about who you are and your experience, and then we'll look at how we're going to talk through some of the challenges that you think schools will be facing at the moment.
Okay, my name is Karin, obviously, and I was a head teacher for more than 20 years in junior schools. I've worked in all 3 phases, and then I've done some inspection work and some strategic work for an authority looking at schools causing concern. I'm now a freelance consultant and have worked as a vet advisor and in a number of other organisations, sharing expertise and looking at new ways forward to reimagine a new future for education, which excites me.
Yeah, I think there's lots of excitement about the future. It's just that the future has kind of been thrust at us a little bit sooner than we were expecting.
So, very much so. It's been turned on its head.
It has a bit.
But this is an opportunity.
It is an opportunity. I think we must look at it that way. So can you talk us through some of the challenges that you think schools are likely to be facing? Some of them might be challenges they face all of the time, and some might have been made worse by the current situations, others may not.
Okay, so I'll just pick the general main challenges and then pick some that I'm seeing more readily at the moment. So recruitment and retention is a huge one for all schools in every phase and has been for quite some time. And obviously that's going to be in terms of looking at COVID now on how teachers are working. That's become difficult because we've got a lot of teachers who are self-isolating and still having to rethink how they're running their classes. Budgets, real problem in schools because there's been huge budget cuts. Technology, bring the technology. You know, many of the schools haven't got the right infrastructure to start with. And if this doesn't shape up people to think about infrastructure and the money that we need for schools and state schools in particular, so that they can actually link with their parents, it's really, really important. And also the inequalities schools are facing between, if you like, those people who are in more deprived areas who don't have the relevant technology to link in. That's a big one. That's a big one that's come to the fore. Obviously, in schools, health and well-being is a big issue, and teachers are not always having the training that they need to deal with the health and well-being issues. High quality teachers, we've got lots of schools who've got teachers in post but not necessarily in the right positions, because with recruitment they've got to get who they can, not necessarily those with the qualifications or the subject expertise. And then there's parenting. Parental engagement is an important one, and one where we've really involved and missed the boat. And if this isn't a catalyst for trying to make parent engagement higher on the agenda, but again, our teachers aren't often trained and find it quite difficult to know how to handle, you know, they go through NQT training and then we put them into their first parent meeting without any real support for them about how to have a conversation with parents who sometimes come from very different backgrounds and have had very different experiences from themselves. So these are some of, you know, the high quality teaching that we need in schools. And obviously then there's the assessment and teacher views of the profession itself. So, you know, they're some of the big challenges that education is facing.
And would you like to, shall we pick some candidates to go through our 10-step criteria? And I have to say to people who are listening, we haven't done this in advance. So what you're going to get is the genuine working through the criteria. So this would be as if I was working with Karin as a head teacher and we were going, okay, we're going to do some AI readiness work. Where are we going to start? So this is exactly the conversation that we would have. So pick any of those to start off with, and let's see how we might.
I'm going to pick recruitment, and the reason I'm recruitment and retention, and the reason I'm going to pick that is because attracting and retaining the right staff to ensure that the school is a rewarding and attractive place to work, because at the end of the day, the goal is for our students, is an important thing. And that's going to be even more important now because I did some work for a global school online, and there's more and more global schools picking up. You need the right person, whether they're in a virtual environment or standing in your classroom, and hopefully goodness knows that we'll always have, you know, face-to-face interaction. That's really, really key.
Right, let's start off with recruitment. And I think at this point, I'm going to observe that right away you see complexity there, because there's recruitment, then there's retaining staff as well. But let's just start with recruitment and probe that for a little bit, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I can say, you know, with my AI hat on, that I know that recruitment is something that we can address using some AI. We can certainly understand more about it. We've done this before, and there are ways that AI could be used to help it, to support human decision making, basically, Karin. So we can tick that box. What about, do we already know enough to get started? How much do you think most schools who are wanting to recruit staff know about how well their current recruitment process is working, how much they believe it's not working well, it is working well, reasons for it working well, not working well, how successful it's been? How much do you think people already know about that?
I think they know often that it's not working well because they don't have anybody come for the jobs, or they might have put the job out 3-4 times, but they're looking at it in a very simplified view. There's very few schools that have the time to really go into the issues. Now, the only reason I say that is because there was key areas in when I was ahead that were having difficulty recruiting. Hampshire, believe it or not, was one of them, and particularly because housing was expensive. And we did try to do that exercise, but until you delve into it, you don't pick up on the issues that you have for recruitment, or in your context, what those issues might be, and trying to involve and crowdsource information from children, teachers, parents about what they thought the issues were, as well as looking at how many people had applied and what jobs we put out, gave us a whole different view of what we were doing and the efforts that we put out.
That's fascinating. I'll come back to that in a minute. So can we know more even if we don't know? You've just basically said yes, because
yes we can. Yeah, we can, and we're doing that against the huge challenges of just starting with a recruitment. That the bit that schools know about is that 1 in 5 new teachers are leaving before they've even started. They're the sorts of things, but whether they've actually done a check on their own school to see how many people have left and how many people have stayed, because you need to know for your context. You know, pressurized data, burdens with data, lack of ongoing support and training, they're the sorts of things that people are worried about when they're going for a teacher job. Lack of recognition and reward. So all of those things are in the media headline, the DFE, tests. Everybody is saying that these are the things, but what is applicable to your school may be very different. It might not just be those things.
That's really interesting. And that really has started to address the next one. How controllable is the context and by whom? You've just said there's all this stuff in the media, that's not in your control. But knowing more about it and knowing more about what's happening in your particular school can help you deal with that. But I think it's certainly important to recognize that the context is not totally controllable by you as a head teacher. And it's hard to pinpoint exactly who else is controlling it. There's lots of different players and they'll have a different impact for different people. So it's important to recognize that. And that might make a difference to the way that we pick the data to look at. What level of uncertainty is there? do you think, when it comes to thinking about recruitment and what's going on in that space?
It's multi-layered. There's some levels of uncertainty in terms of how people feel about excessive workloads, health and well-being. You know, that's the level of uncertainty when you're recruiting somebody, how they're viewing the job before they come into it, whether they've had a job before or not. So there are levels of uncertainty like that, but there are some things within your control that you can look at.
Yeah, interesting. And how much data do you already have? So as you in your school,
right?
But obviously you may be very different to other schools, but how much data, before you did that exercise maybe, and then we can talk about afterwards, would you normally have, and do you think most schools would have, about the recruitment challenge?
So in my school itself, I always reported on new staff are being employed, and I had a chart which said how many were leaving, how many were staying, and how many years they'd worked in the school. So I had that in my context, so for many years, because I thought it was really important to do and to keep a tally of. I also had data on pay, because we were right on the border of two authorities, being in Hampshire, we were right on the border of Surrey and Berkshire, both who paid out of London waiting. So Hampshire doesn't. So it was interesting for me to have that piece of information and that understanding of, okay, how was that pay affecting? What I didn't have is what would have been useful to me is to find the other local schools that I could virtually wash their windows to find out how they were doing with recruitment. Did that make a difference? Or was I assuming that because they paid out to London waiting? Because, there's more things to the job than some people. It's not just about pay. It's about the conditions of service and about, reward and recognition in a whole different way. So knowing what other schools were doing, I hadn't got that. I didn't know what they were doing in terms of recognition and reward, or in terms of, how many people they were gaining or losing per year. That would have been really, really useful to me. Knowing what their packages for support were as well. What we did know is how people were advertising, because we kept a very close eye on the adverts in terms of, so from that, if we've counted the data of how many, but we did systematically look to see different schools when we were ever putting an ad out, what sort of ads they were putting out. Tend to follow the same pattern. So that gave us some information about what we could put in adverts, the content of the adverts to be the same sort of thing. So you didn't stand out from the crowd. So we had that by looking at adverts. We looked at them across the country, we looked at them in tests, we looked at them in all the different ways that people were advertising. Also looking at supply agencies and what they were doing, because obviously the school's got a huge proportion of supply teachers. So that was important. Also looking, what we did have was staff. I had, if you like, a database of staff that were in the job in the right role, if that makes sense, that weren't filling a role because I hadn't got anyone else. So that's a concrete piece of data I would have. How many people had I employed that were good teachers in a role that I needed filling? And how many people might have been good teachers but weren't necessarily best placed to where I had them.
And so that can, of course, impact on whether they stay or not.
So they were the certainties I had. The uncertainties were comparisons with other schools, the benchmarking stuff with other schools. It was more finger in the wind. So there were little bits, but not enough.
Interesting. And certainly possible to collect more data. You've got quite a lot, but you've already identified data that you don't have, potential data sources, such as supply agencies.
One of the data bits we didn't have until the very end, when it dawned on me I should be doing this, was the cost of recruitment. I didn't do an exercise till the very end. So I'd gone for 19 years without ever having, we're poor with budgets. And had I ever looked at the cost of the type of recruitment I was doing? So yes, what an advert costs basically, but it's more than an advert, isn't it? It's the time for interviewing, the time out of class, the observations. We hadn't done that piece, and I don't think many schools do. What does it cost to actually recruit and retain a teacher properly, not just the advert that goes in? So we hadn't done that piece of work in any depth. And when we started to do it, we realized there was a lot more once you start doing, a work study of how many people are out to recruit, the time lag, and so forth. That actual cost is much bigger than the advert because that's what most schools tend to do. They budget for the cost of the advert. They don't budget for the time that different people have to take in order when they're not doing their work to do the interview process.
And presumably you would have to bring in supply teachers at an additional cost.
Yes.
To free up those members of staff, right? So there's a real cost implication.
Yeah, and there's
there.
admin costs as well, because, you know, in my school we used to have the admin involved, taking them around the school as well, because we thought it was really important as a team that we had a different view. So all of that was really important. But then when the admin officer's not, you know, when they're doing a tour, it's really difficult. It's really the cost of different amounts of people. If you're going to do it real justice, and then if they're going to do a trial lesson or teach a lesson, all of that has to be accounted for in terms of people out of where they would normally be. And if you've got different people watching and doing different parts of the interview, you know, sometimes you can't just put them back into class midway through. They're out for the morning. So again, the actual real costs of advertising and interviewing is very high, much higher than the initial cost that you would.
So hidden costs are a big factor, and we certainly collect data about that. And then there's sort of logistic issues, from what I understand, about people coming out of Clark going, okay, great. A question more from me perhaps now, how accurate can we be? Well, with all of that sort of data that you're talking about, I think we could be quite accurate in our analysis using our AI tools of the particular challenge. Doesn't necessarily mean we can come up with a solution, but we can certainly add some information. And interestingly enough, one of the organizations, who are a wonderful organization that we've worked with for several years now, one of the first pieces of work we did for them was around recruitment. And it was really interesting how shocked they were when they realized exactly how many staff that they'd trained had not stayed. And so they'd spent huge amounts of money training staff, and then those people didn't stay. So it's kind of interesting and a huge problem. And obviously recruitment, you know, does the institution have an appetite to change? Well, obviously you're a head teacher. You know, if one was to look at a whole lot of data that perhaps you haven't already looked at, and mix it together with the data you have already looked at and do the analysis, if it came up with a sort of a radical finding that you weren't aware of, that might mean that it was worth considering something significantly different, would you be willing to consider it? Of course, you don't know until you know what that suggestion might be. But in general, I get the impression you were quite an innovative school. So you probably have a reasonable appetite for change.
Yes, I think we did, because what we tried to do as well, it's not just the advert. If you're really going to look at recruitment intention, you've got to look at the wording. You know, what words attract people? Is it going to just be you know, a written advert? Is it going to be? We even tried radio adverts, believe it or not. You know, we really tried, and we crowdsourced our advert with the staff actually writing the adverts to see if did that make a difference. Because actually, as a head, sometimes you have ownership of these things and you bang them out without any real thought about what your school family needs and wants. You might include a couple of questionnaires to parents and children, but actually it needs to be, you know, it needs to be more than that. The other thing is, when you're putting a package together, if you want to retain and recruit, retain them, what's going to be in that package? Are you going to offer them further training? Who's going to be the mentor? And one of the things we didn't have really was, we had trained people with coaching and mentorship, but we hadn't really done any assessment of which people, you know, you had a feel for which people got on with who and did well. But actually, in terms of making a difference to that person, had we got a really concrete way of doing it other than a gut feel that somebody liked somebody? No, we hadn't. That was another one of our issues, looking at coaches and mentors, looking at packages for induction, and trying to find out, that was another one, what it is, because different people starting your school need different things depending on their experience and their expertise. So that was another one, trying to think of ways of collating, you know, if you're going to attract people, what are some of the key things that everybody wants? And then how are you going to make sure that you've got the flexibility to give those people, and to put it in some sort of form of words or spoken word when you're advertising, of other opportunities that would be available that would make your school stand out from the crowd and show that you want it to be a rewarding place to work.
And that's
so
really interesting.
A really interesting thing that we hadn't done was really look at our mentors and coaches to see, okay, you've done a course, you've had some opportunities, but how do we know, and are you right for the type of person, you know, are you right for the NQT or are you right for and what should be the first week for that person? So when you get them for interview and they've accepted, you know, they say, well, I'm thinking, you know, I am quite interested in the job, and you walk them around, what are you going to tell them that's going to hook them in? Your first week, NQTs particularly, they're really worried about their first few weeks. So have we got a plan, a package of being able to say, as soon as they come around to school, this is what we're going to give to you. This is what your first few weeks will look like. This is the support.
That language issue is really interesting. And although it's not for this week to think about identifying data and thinking about AI methods, one thing I will say is that one of the strengths of AI, where it could be used, is to look at language being used in adverts, lots of different adverts, language being used as part of the interview process, language being used in the pack that people receive, in terms of what's working, what's not working, and what messages are being sent. And interestingly, you know, another area for possible consideration with an issue around recruitment would be body language, facial expressions. What are we communicating? And actually looking at some data, you know, to see what's going on. And interestingly enough, with another organization where we went through a process to help them with recruitment, it was very interesting how they were convinced that they were recruiting people who were X, Y, and Z, but in actual fact, they were recruiting people who were X, Y, and A. You know, there was a mismatch between actually what they thought was going on, not a huge one, but enough to make a difference, and what was actually going on. So it's interesting. When you're talking to me, I can immediately think of areas where we could use some analytical tools from AI to help understand much more what's happening in that recruitment. And obviously recruiting is a crucial challenge. So you've got to get the right staff. And then of course you've got to train them, maintain them. Now it's, we've got 13 minutes left. So I'm actually going to go to Roland and see if there are any questions before we talk anymore, because if there is a question, we could deal with it together now. Roland, is there anything that you would like us to answer? Or does anybody want to ask one now?
Sure. I've got one just in terms of parental engagement. It's really for both you and Karine, Rose. Do you know of any circumstances where, you know, AI has been used to motivate or assist, you know, understanding parental engagement or motivating parental engagement, particularly with, you know, disadvantaged families or families from just different backgrounds?
Such a good question. I'll say something about the AI, but then I will bring Karin to say something more about the parental engagement piece. We didn't actually get to build AI into this, but about, what's the year now, 14 years ago, we were doing a study about parental engagement using technology, and we built a platform that would operate in the class and then would operate at home. And each child, these were 5-year-olds, was given a tablet PC. It was before iPads existed. And we would communicate with parents using these tablets. The activities the child had done in school around maths could be viewed again. Lots of them were videos and exercises at home. And then there were additional activities to be done at home, guidance for parents. And what we had built within this was a model, which is a sort of a very typical part of an AI system. In this instance, what we were trying to do was to build a profile of a particular family, not in any kind of secretive black box way, but trying to understand the needs of that family. And had we continued with the project, and the only reason we didn't continue with the project, by the way, because it was a research project and the project ended and there was no more money left, would have been to think about how we could have built an adaptive version of that platform that would have used some AI to try and make sure that what was offered to the family was more suitable for that family than for another family. So to try and personalize to an extent. I definitely think there's room for AI to help when it comes to parental engagement. Karine, over to you.
Okay, so I'm glad you answered about the AI, because I don't know of an AI platform that's helped with parental engagement, but parental engagement is absolutely crucial, even more so now. You know, it's actually, we're at the right point for some catalyst for change. What schools tend to do is involve rather than engage parents. And part of that is because there's not a lot of training for teachers on how to really work with parents, particularly that come from very different backgrounds and have very different views from perhaps the teachers themselves. And time to really listen to understand what the perspectives are. Now, as a teacher, you're dealing with a myriad of problems anyway, because you're dealing with families that are made up in very different ways with very different problems. But the issue, well, not all of them, but many of them. And the issue for parental engagement is that it's context specific as well, from school to school. You can't, if you've got what's happened in schools is bolt-on approaches over the years, where schools have come up with an idea and they've bolted it on and then added another bit. It needs to be a whole school strategy, with the end goal always being the child at the end, with their learning and their well-being. But we also have to understand where the parents are coming from, what their issues are before you can even start to talk with parents to engage them. Now, they are crucial to learning. There's been study after study after study that's shown that with parents on board, you can exponentially increase children's learning abilities and their cognitive abilities. But we can only do that if we recognise it has to be done in a whole school strategy. It has to be context specific. We need training for teachers, and we need to have a vision for it before we start, rather than what's happened over the years is this bolt-on approach, which is more involvement than engagement, because we're not always listening to what parents need. We're giving what we believe they need rather than what they do need. And across the school, you will have parents that need very different things. I'm sorry, we could talk all day on that one. That would be a whole, if AI could do something for closing the gap between involvement and engagement, it would be phenomenal. Because
I think we could do something to personalize that. Well, I'm convinced from the project that we had several years ago. Now, Roland, I think there's another question come in from Fiona. Is that right?
Yep. So it's she said, I think of Karine said earlier, it's never been more important to understand our teachers to ensure we get the right kind of teacher for the right kind of role. So for teachers using technologies, what do we want and what should we need to know, and how can we use AI to sort of gather and understand that information?
Okay, so for me, what do we want from a teacher? So I want a teacher, in my school, I wanted some teachers that were able to use tech. The reality is, the majority of us and their own head teacher, myself, was not very tech savvy when I started. You have to be willing to learn, to change, to make mistakes, to reflect, review, and evaluate. So that's what I want from a teacher first. If I can get a teacher that has some expertise in tech that can share their knowledge. So in my school, I was able to, and they trained us as well. But the teacher themselves, generally, you've got to have teachers who are willing to learn, because particularly I was in a junior school. So in a junior school, you're going to be master of many subjects, but you still need somebody with a core of understanding. So when I managed to get that person, we moved very quickly. But all the other teachers still have to be able to be flexible and adaptable and want to learn. And that can only happen if you give teachers the right conditions to learn and the time to do it. So there's an issue to do with leadership. I haven't answered the second part of your question. You might have to remind me what it was again, Fiona, sorry.
It was for teachers using the tech. What do they want? What do they need to know? And how can we use AI to sort of gather that info?
What they need from the tech is it to be functioning first, and the infrastructure to be sound. Every time they open the laptop, it doesn't go down, or the software they're using doesn't crash. They need a good infrastructure in their school. They need resources that they're taught at. They do not need I go into schools that have got tons of resources that are locked in cupboards. One person's brought in and then they leave and nobody knows how to use it. So they need a few things that they can use well, that it's going to reach the goals and the vision that they've set in their strategic plan. They need to know it works. They need the right training for it. That's what teachers need to start with. If they have those things, they can move quickly. What I see in lots and lots of schools, particularly our state schools where we're not, we just don't have the budget. People come in, they buy a few things, they leave, and they haven't got the infrastructure. And particularly with COVID, I've seen that over and over again with things falling around their ears. Some teachers knowing how to use it, some not. Because there's been no in-depth training and no time to make mistakes, to learn, to reflect. So that's what teachers need. They need a really good package of training, and they need the resources. There's no point in me saying which specific resources they need. They need resources to close the gaps in the learning, if we want every child to count, that matters for their context and their school. We also need to know on our population, if we're expecting children outside of school to use that sort of technology, what technology they have. So again, so that the teachers can use it properly. And whether we like it or not, I've learned a lot about myself during this COVID. You know, I've been a teacher since 1982 in one phase or another. But I taught online recently. You know, I'm talking about not just uploading stuff, I'm talking about every day teaching online children in Berlin. I learned so much about the interactions between how you have to be a different person online to develop that relationship. So again, that's a whole set of training that teachers need. And we cannot keep throwing things at them. So we need to take it, you know, we need to be clear about what our vision is, be clear about our infrastructure, and that whatever resources we bring work, and then we need someone to train us. And if you haven't got them in school, we need to get somebody in, but you have to have the budget to do it. And schools often are tinkering at the edges because they don't have that budget. And then you need a good sound survey that looks at what your children, your parenting population has, if you want to make that work remotely, and through engagement with, you know, with parents. What do they have at home? What can you use? And if they don't have it, what other ways can you do it? So that's what I think they need in terms of the technology. It's the training and it's the time.
And is there a role for AI? Absolutely, Fiona. In actual fact, that's one of the issues that we're looking at the moment as part of Educate, to develop a platform to help schools do precisely what Karin has just described. You know, you start off with a fundamental need in that school, the prioritizing the need, and then translating that into what that looks like in the classroom, auditing what resources you have available to you, but not just the technology, the human resource that understands how that technology works, because so often technology is brought in and then a teacher moves away and nobody knows how to use that technology. And then looking at how you design careful interventions and you collect data about those interventions to see if they work. And the AI piece in this is about matching. So matching what we know works in one community that has a similar problem to potentially being something that another community can try. And so building up a really intelligent database across the UK of what works where, with whom and why, with evidence at its heart. And of course, that's the kind of stuff that AI can really get its teeth into. And there's also ways of providing AI support for training, which, as Karin has said, is just so important when it comes to using the technology. But too often it starts from the technology rather than the fundamental need that a particular school has. And actually the process that we've developed and piloted has so far, fortunately, shown up savings for schools when they recognize, for example, that they're paying for software licenses that nobody's using because nobody knows how to use that particular piece of technology. So there is a way in which AI can help in this situation. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but that was a great conversation. Thank you, Karine, for joining me. That was really, really enjoyable for me and very interesting as well. And I'm sure it was interesting for the audience. Thank you. And so all it remains for me to say is that we'll be here again in 2 weeks' time, looking at the next step along the way. These webinars are available on YouTube, and for a shorter version, which is just me talking over the slides, that's also available to download from educateventures.com. And if you've got any questions, just email help@educateventures.com. So thank you to everybody for joining us. Thank you for the questions. It's always great to get questions. It helps us understand more about what you need to know. And I hope you can join us again in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks very much. Thanks, Karin. Thanks, Roland. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
Right.